Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Peterson. I oversee the Emerging Leaders Program at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to you all, and especially our members, for joining us this evening for these on-the-record policy flash talks from members of the Emerging Leaders Class of 2021. As a reminder, the Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals that we host on our platform are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. As many of you know, the Emerging Leaders Program invests in Chicago's globally minded professionals to equip them to understand and address how what happens in Chicago affects the world and how what happens in the world affects Chicago. Emerging Leaders alumni serve in Congress, lead key Chicago nonprofits tackling issues of equity, and lead companies that support our city's social and economic landscape. In short, ELs do great things to bring real change to the world. Now, the class of 2021 has certainly been one for the history books. From their home offices and dining room tables, this cohort has exclusively met online since July due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This hasn't stopped them from putting big questions to leaders and experts on some of the most challenging issues facing our world. These emerging leaders have shown up in hard times and have demonstrated the kind of resilience that you want to see in decision makers of today and into the future. So, congratulations to members of this year's class. The Council is so proud to count you amongst our ranks. Now, for this evening. You will be hearing from 7 members of the current class of the Emerging Leaders Program. Their policy talks were developed over the course of the program year with feedback from Council staff, project mentors, and EL program advisor, Cecile Shea. Each emerging leader will present a 5-minute policy proposal. These flash talks emphasize the need for equitable and sound policies domestically that address the challenges we face here at home in order to bolster the United States leadership globally. After their presentations, we welcome your questions. In order to submit those questions, please log into your browser and type in ccga.live. You'll follow the on-screen prompts, and there you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite question. Now, let me introduce you to our first speaker of the evening, Lauren Densham, who will be speaking about the importance of prison apprenticeships to support badly needed infrastructure development.
Consider 2 seemingly independent challenges which we are facing in the US today. The first is the shortage of skilled labor in the construction trades. Investment in infrastructure is expected to be a critical component of a climate-friendly and equitable post-COVID recovery. However, there is a nationwide shortage in the talent in the skilled trades that would be needed to actually build this infrastructure. The second challenge is the lack of employment opportunities for individuals post-incarceration. Returning citizens face significant barriers in securing employment following release, including a lack of marketable skills and stigma amongst employers. This results in an unemployment rate which is 5 times higher than the general public, impeding former inmates' ability to rebuild their lives after prison. My proposal aims to address both of these issues simultaneously through paid prison apprenticeships in the skilled trades. Specifically, I propose that any federal infrastructure package should include funding for states to build or expand upon prison apprenticeship programs in the skilled trades. Prison apprenticeships are comprised of the same components as traditional apprenticeships, including technical instruction and paid on-the-job training. These programs exist now in an increasing number of states, but are still very small. As of 2016, there were only 9,000 inmates enrolled in apprenticeship programs, and most of these were in lower skilled occupations such as housekeeping. States such as Kentucky are exploring innovative new ways to deliver these apprenticeships, including partnering with local community colleges, as well as work release with outside employers. Federal funding could jumpstart the development of programs where they don't exist now and expand upon existing programs. The infrastructure plan proposed by President Biden acknowledges the need for investment in apprenticeships. It aims to fund 2 million new apprenticeship slots while also enhancing the pipeline of women and people of color coming into the trades. However, it makes no mention of programs within prisons. I believe that overlooking the prison population would be a mistake for 3 key reasons. The first is that prison apprenticeships would match a known skills gap to a vastly underemployed pool of talent. In 2019, there were over 200,000 unfilled construction positions nationwide, with 85% of firms struggling to meet deadlines. This issue is worsening significantly as the boomer generation retires and young talent focuses on 4-year degrees and other career paths. Meanwhile, right now, there are 1.3 million individuals serving limited terms inside state and federal prisons, and 70% of them desire more formal training programs. This is a robust pipeline of diverse talent with interest in these roles. Secondly, prison apprenticeships would create net cost savings over the long term. Currently, over 83% of former inmates are expected to recidivate, meaning return to prison following release. This is expensive and will cost Illinois alone more than $13 billion in the next 5 years, and that is just one state. Studies have found that prison apprenticeships have the potential to reduce recidivism by over 43%. In fact, a study by the Washington State Institute for Public Policy estimates that while the cost of in-prison vocational training is around $2,000 per inmate, they create a net cost savings of $12,000 when accounting for reduced recidivism. In short, prison apprenticeships pay for themselves over the long term by a long shot. Finally, prison apprenticeships could support public sector agencies to address their own pipeline challenges while stemming the rising cost of contracted work. This pipeline challenge is particularly acute in places like departments of transportation or transit agencies who are facing a wave of retirements and struggle to compete with the private sector for talent. Employment pathways from these types of programs can reduce the cost that these agencies pay to recruit and retain skilled trades positions. Additionally, a significant proportion of public sector construction work is actually contracted out to the private sector, 70% of whom say that their costs are rising due to labor shortages. Therefore, prison apprenticeships could reduce costs to the public sector regardless of where these employees ultimately end up working. Now, prison apprenticeships are not a panacea for either of the challenges that I've laid out here. Both require broader investment in things like workforce development and criminal justice reform to fully resolve. However, prison apprenticeship offer these unique areas of overlap, this middle, where the same dollar can meaningfully address both issues simultaneously while also creating long-term cost savings. Not only is this the smart thing to do, it's also the right thing to do. As the apprenticeship coordinator at the Iowa Department of Corrections states, reentry preparation should begin the minute an individual walks through our prison doors. Apprenticeship programs offered on the inside, which link to real economic opportunities on the outside, make that possible. Thank you.
What do we do in 2050 if we have well-built cities, but a weak economy because of an underdeveloped workforce? This may seem like a far-fetched idea, but I don't think it is. With Citibank estimating that over the last 20 years, the US has lost $16 trillion in its GDP solely because of racial inequality. And with the fact that it's estimated that by the year 2050, the majority of the adult population in the US will be people of color, it's evident that we need a new approach. A new approach that helps us more effectively measure how cities create a pipeline for inclusive growth, which is why I recommend that Bloomberg Philanthropies develops the Pathways to 2050 Index that will do exactly this, help cities understand how they can build a pathway for inclusive growth. In doing this, the index will work alongside existing programs within Bloomberg Philanthropies and using 3 components to do this. The first component is actually youth-centered. And so why are youth an important index in helping us understand how we build a more equitable future in cities? Well, one, it's because youth are an excellent proxy for what's happening in communities. So when we hear that 1 in 6 children are living food insecure, those kids are not living on their own. They're living in families that lack the money to get food, and they're living in communities that have limited access to resources. So as we measure what's happening with youth along the entire cradle to career continuum, it allows us to plan today for the issues that we can do to impact not only youth, but their families and the entire community. The second reason why creating a cradle to career baseline on any index is critically important as we think about how we move forward with equity is because youth are also a great opportunity for us to think through what does it mean to mitigate inequality in the long term. You see, the cradle to career continuum is something that already exists. Schools are using it, communities use it to understand what's happening along the entire continuum of a child's life. In fact, California has recently developed an entire data system to help them understand how schools can more effectively develop the entire continuum to get youth into college. And so when we understand what's happening from prenatal all the way to career readiness, we're able to map what we can do today in order to better impact youth for the future. If you're familiar with what the Human Capital Index does with the World Bank, it's exactly this. It looks over the course of 6 indicators for youth and establishes what we do with youth today. What will that mean for the country in the next 18 years when that cohort becomes adults? And how effectively will the country have productivity? And so I recommend that we do this on a smaller scale, looking at cities, being able to look on the long-term time horizon and measure how exactly we are working with youth in order to ensure that when they become adults, we've built the types of pipelines across all residents in cities that make it more equitable. The second component to this is evaluating the roots. And so typically when we look at programs like job placement or measuring 8th grade reading levels, unemployment, it's essentially assessing how we can better invest in the fruit. So if we think about a tree as a city, we have to do more than just look at the branches and the fruit and what we do there, but we have to go deeper. And that's where we really need to evaluate what's happening in the roots. It's the city infrastructure that creates a lot of the inequality that we see, not just the outcomes of individuals like their ability to read or get jobs. And so when we think about issues with employment, it's not just creating workforce readiness that we have to do. It's also ensuring that as we graduate people, they're going back to communities that have transportation for them to get to the jobs that we prepared them for. It's quality healthcare, it's housing policies, and all these things happen below the surface that we typically don't see. And so as we begin to measure how we more effectively approach inequality, we can't just look at the outcomes and the individual measures. We have to look at the roots. This not only helps us in ensuring what we do today, but it also allows us to think more critically about how we use our resources. Because when we can address the underlying structural issues, it actually improves multiple facets of what we see on the outside. And so that brings me to the third thing that this does, and that's mapping and simulating. The reason why mapping is so critically important when we look at an index is because information is great, but if we don't have the ability to apply it, then it does nothing for us. And that's why as this initiative develops an index that measures what's happening at the roots, using youth as a primary indicator, and then building on top of that all the issues that are happening within the civic infrastructure. We have to provide cities the ability to really map what they can do. And actually, Bloomberg Philanthropies is already doing this with the government innovation initiatives. They're working with cities to better assess how they use data to support all residents. And so what I think is what we need to do is go further with that, not only certifying cities, which is what the initiative already does, but ensuring that cities are able to see all of the aspects of how they contribute. So for example, recent research demonstrated that if Chicago were less segregated, it could see $4.4 billion in additional income every year, lower homicide rates, and more bachelor's degrees. What if we had a measure that helped us understand all the underlying factors that contribute to this, and then we're able to work with Chicago in order to assess not only the policies that need to change, but the types of public-private partnerships that contribute to this? How much would it reduce duplicate efforts? How much would we be able to plan better the business initiatives in order to improve the city, not just the policy changes that we need? And that's why I believe developing an index that looks holistically at the systems and on a long-term trajectory will help us not only address the issues of inequality that we see today, but also tomorrow. Why is this so important? Well, the pandemic last year demonstrated exactly what happens when we don't invest in all residents. It not only impacts the people who experience inequality, it impacts the entire city, our infrastructure, our economy, the health and well-being, and the social structure. And so that is why it's critical to do this today. So it's not a question of how we change the policy and how we invest more in understanding what's happening. It's really a question of, can we afford not to?
College affordability is a crisis. It's a crisis that negatively impacts opportunity for post-secondary access and success, which in turn affects all areas of our society, ranging from impeding our nation's ability to provide a skilled workforce pipeline and how we achieve equitable economic growth. While there are many areas to address around college affordability, I want to turn our attention to the burden of student housing costs. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has recently found that housing instability influences college student behavior, such as enrolling part-time and having to take on work while in school, which adds to a student's overall time to degree. A longer time to degree can significantly add to the cost of degree completion through both the additional payments of cost of attendance and the opportunity cost of foregoing potential earnings. These factors, of course, impact students' ability to even graduate. Housing affordability issues are also widespread. In 2019, the California Student Aid Commission conducted a survey across the state's college students, finding that a full 1/3 of the respondents shared that they don't have enough resources to cover housing utilities, and relatedly, 35% were classified as housing insecure. A solution directly addressing housing costs should be preferred over what is perhaps the most politically active proposal for college affordability currently, student debt cancellation. And this is because several experts have argued that debt cancellation does not necessarily shrink the racial wealth gap, and that debt relief would end up distributing the vast majority of support to the top 20% of income earners. Therefore, I propose a policy solution that builds upon an established foundation that already primarily serves our nation's low to middle income students. Specifically, I propose that the federal Pell Grant program should be reformed into a split grant program to provide a more tailored support of students' housing needs in a manner that does not diminish their support for tuition and fee needs. By way of background, the federal Pell Grant program, established in 1965, was designed to be the core foundation of financial aid for higher education students from low to middle income families. In the previous academic year, Pell served nearly 7 million undergraduates with a maximum award amount of about $6,200 per recipient. 70% of all recipients in 2016 had annual family incomes below $30,000. While the maximum Pell Grant Award has increased over the previous 4 decades, Pell has not kept pace with rising tuition costs, nor with the total cost of attendance, which include housing and board. The steady increase of room and board costs have affected the enrollment decisions and outcomes of low-income students. Today, Pell is no longer the primary source of financial aid. In 2017, Pell Grants covered only 29% of the average cost of attendance, far below the 79% it covered in 1975. 2 ambitious proposals for college affordability through Pell and other means have been introduced by President Biden and by Senator Sanders and Representative Jayapal. Therefore, there's recognition that a solution should center around Pell, but there's little political agreement on how best to improve the program. To address with more precision the diminished buying power of Pell from the increased weight of housing costs, my proposal would focus on modernizing the Pell Grant program to be split into 2 need-based aid awards. Pell Grant A, designed to be used only for tuition, and Pell Grant B, only for housing costs. There are a few reasons why I've proposed this policy solution and in this particular design. First, a federal solution is best to address this problem because colleges calculate the cost of attendance differently and thereby set aside different percentages of financial aid for housing, even among colleges in the same region. Second, the split award allows for adaptation in the Pell Grant program to the varied funding and enrollment circumstances of today's students. 2-year and technical programs are typically lower in tuition and in some states tuition-free, but housing costs associated with attendance remain. As the current lifetime eligibility of Pell is equivalent to 6 academic years, this reform would provide flexibility of use by allowing the split awards to have separate lifetime eligibility requirements. Finally, a split in the awards would better facilitate efforts to increase award amounts at a later date. And this is because policymakers will be able to make future adjustments of either grant award in a more targeted manner. For instance, if average tuition increases more rapidly than housing or vice versa. In closing, federal Pell Grants are designed to support the neediest college students, but has not kept pace with the cost of attendance for students who most rely on need-based aid. A reformed Pell program that provides both tuition and housing support separately would reduce barriers to college completion for the most financially disadvantaged students towards increasing the number of college graduates. Furthermore, this reform would provide tailored support through greater precision by addressing separately the growing housing burden on students' opportunity for college access and success. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. COVID-19 has highlighted societal inequities and exacerbated pre-existing disparities in racial health outcomes. For example, in Chicago, Black people accounted for 68% of deaths due to COVID-19. Significant efforts have been invested in closing that gap, and there have been improvements. However, disparities remain. Black people now account for 39% of deaths, while white people account for 22%. The reasons for this are complex. Here in Chicago, we can look at racist policies like redlining, which have led to historic disinvestment, food deserts, and environmental injustice, which are all contributing factors to pervasive pre-existing medical conditions and lack of access to quality care in communities of color. While addressing health disparities will take a multifaceted approach, one place we can start is close to home. I propose that the Department of Health and Human Services require hospitals to establish a community advisory board to serve as a bridge between people of color served by the hospital and the hospital staff. Why do we need community advisory boards? Historic mistreatment from the government and from healthcare providers remain in the collective memories of Black Americans and have led to mistrust at a time when we need people to trust them. For example, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where Black men believed they were receiving treatment from the government for syphilis, when instead, without their knowledge, the US government gave them placebo pills and then tracked the devastating impact of the virus on their bodies. Provider bias remains a concern. Biases and honestly systemic racism lead to assumptions about Black people, and this has an impact on the quality of care that they receive. As an example, in 2016, 40% of medical residents surveyed believed that Black people were more impervious to pain than white people. Now, this is important because Black patients are less likely than white patients to receive pain medication when complaining of the same or similar issues. We need to get to the root of this mistrust. Community advisory boards can advise hospitals on training, on perceived problems or lack of care for certain communities, and on areas in need of improvement, while also serving as a bridge and a source of communication between the hospital and the community. Who will serve on community advisory boards and how will they operate? Well, they will be comprised of people who know the needs of their community. Elected officials, community leaders, faith-based leaders will all apply to join. The hospital can then establish a transparent selection process that ensures true community representation. They will meet regularly or at least quarterly with hospital administrators to express community concerns, ask what has been done to address previous issues, and look for ways to help the hospital share out information with the community. Once a year, the committee and the hospital will report to the Department of Health and Human Services on results of the meetings, progress that has occurred, and areas for improvement. Funding will be tied to how they address the concerns raised by the task force. This already works. Federally qualified health centers are community-based health centers that serve approximately 24 million people. They serve majority people of color, and their funding from the government is tied to providing quality care on a sliding scale, and most importantly, they're governed by 51% of residents of the communities they serve. So what happens in these communities served by community health centers? Well, the services are tailored to the needs of the communities they serve, and in these communities, health disparities are reduced. In fact, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, community-level solutions work to reduce health disparities caused by differences in race and ethnicity. There is still a need for hospitals and traditional healthcare facilities. However, if they choose to receive government funding, they must be held accountable to be receptive to the needs of the community. And so community advisory boards can raise concerns, hold hospitals accountable for addressing those concerns, and assist in communicating important information. And finally, why should we care? Well, aside from the obvious ethical and moral reasons, this is costly. The total cost of racial health disparities in 2009 was approximately $82 billion. That's $60 billion in excess healthcare costs and $22 billion in lost productivity. That is increased. In 2020, it went up to $135 billion. And there's a potential economic gain of $135 billion per year if we address disparities in racial health outcomes. So erasing racial health disparities and improving health outcomes for our communities of color is the morally right and economically advantageous thing to do. It will require a variety of approaches, but one place we can start is close to home with community advisory boards. Thank you.
In March 2020, Chicago Public Schools closed for what many people believed would be several weeks due to COVID-19. The closures triggered widespread concern about learning loss, particularly with respect to students from economically disadvantaged families. But closing school for weeks with no plan to continue or maintain student learning is hardly out of the ordinary. We do this every year in the form of a 10-week summer vacation. For many students, summer vacation is not an idyllic blend of outdoor play and enriching camps. Rather, it is an extended period of isolation or unstructured time that contributes to academic, physical, and social regression. On the academic front, students generally suffer declines in both math and reading during the summers. Researchers comparing spring and fall performance on standardized tests have estimated this summer slide to be, on average, a loss of about 25 to 30% of school year gains. Anecdotally, I was a math teacher for 5 years before I went to law school, and my experience was that summer learning loss is very real. Research also shows that on average, summer learning loss is greater among economically disadvantaged students. And for a sense of scale, that's roughly 4 out of every 5 CPS students. These summer declines are cumulative. Even if academic gains during the school year are identical, a student who suffers more than average summer learning loss will finish school multiple grade levels behind a student at the other end of the curve. That's demonstrated in this chart, which shows differences in English and language arts outcomes for 3 hypothetical students using actual summer learning loss data. The blue is school year learning, and the red is summer. The middle line shows a student who suffers average rates of summer learning loss. The top is a student who's losing less than average each summer. And the bottom is a student who's 1 standard deviation below the mean in terms of summer learning loss. So they're losing even more. Although our 3 students are learning at the exact same rate during the school year, look how much they fan out by the end of 8th grade, due solely to summer learning loss. And on top of the academic losses, summer vacation also drives poor physical health metrics for economically disadvantaged students. To address the ill effects of the traditional school calendar, I propose that Chicago Public Schools extend the school year for grades pre-K through 5 by 25 instructional days, leaving a 5-week summer vacation. Researchers generally agree that addressing the problem of summer learning loss and opportunity gaps requires robust, widely available summer programs. So why not just extend existing summer programs? In 2016, a group of policy researchers at RAND performed a literature review regarding existing summer programs with the goal of identifying the characteristics of successful programs in order to guide policymakers. Here's what they found. Effective summer programs are available to students at early grade levels. They have policies to maximize participation and attendance. They use evidence-based curricula that align with school year instruction and delivered by qualified teachers. So policymakers looking to close achievement gaps could take this list and try to create summer programs that have all of these characteristics. But when I look at this list, I think, I recognize this. They're talking about school. So rather than create something new that tries to emulate school, we should leverage our existing infrastructure by extending the school year. How would we pay for that? Well, the initial outlay could come from COVID-related federal funds and grant monies that are aimed at reducing learning loss caused by the pandemic. Money could also be shifted from existing city summer programs. But the program should quickly be paying for itself through a reallocation of existing funds. As the extended school year significantly reduces the summer slide, CPS will not need to allocate nearly as much money to remedial specialists and grade retention programs. That's what New Mexico found when it launched a program called K through 3 Plus in 2011. That program added 25 days to the school year on a voluntary basis. And it was found so effective that the state extended it through 5th grade, and researchers analyzing the program concluded it paid for itself. And when we think about the costs of an extended school year, we should also be thinking about the wasted spending associated with the current calendar. We accept that we're going to have schools and we're going to spend a lot of money to operate them. Yet every summer, we're throwing away, on average, 25% of the gains made in the prior school year solely because of the calendar. That's just bad investing. Extending the school year will maximize the return on our investment in education, and the long-term benefits of stemming summer learning loss are legion. The extended school year will bring a healthier population, increased well-being, and a better qualified labor force with concomitant economic growth. We have a tool to advance all of those goals, schools, but we need a little more of it. Thank you.
In 1961, President Kennedy created the Peace Corps to promote world peace and friendship with 3 simple goals in mind. The first goal is the technical support provided by volunteers in sectors such as health, education, and agriculture. The second goal is the role that volunteers play as part of communities overseas, promoting a better understanding of Americans on the part of the people that they're serving. And the third goal is the role that volunteers play when they return to the United States, promoting a better understanding of other people, places, and cultures on the part of Americans. And this third goal is just as relevant today as it was in 1961. A recent poll by Gallup, commissioned by the Council on Foreign Relations, concluded that although adult Americans show limited knowledge about geography and world affairs, 7 in 10 respondents consider international issues to be relevant to their daily lives and express a desire to promote education in these areas. This is consistent with the third goal, the desire to bring global understanding back to Americans. Yet only 0.3% of the current Peace Corps budget contributes toward advancing the third goal of the Peace Corps. So I'm proposing a way to better fulfill the third goal. In order to inform and engage more Americans in global issues in the United States foreign affairs, the Peace Corps should fund return volunteers to spend 1 year upon their return to the United States, educating fellow Americans in their congressional districts about key global issues related to their sector of service. The experience Peace Corps volunteers gain overseas is an investment in US citizens that can benefit other Americans. And recent studies come to similar conclusions. The National Peace Corps Association released a community report in 2020 that encouraged the Peace Corps to increase its funding and staff resources for the third goal, and to better leverage the expertise that's been developed by volunteers overseas. And a study done by the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation also found that Peace Corps volunteers want a domestic option for service, particularly one that takes advantage of their skill sets in areas like public health, food security, and economic security. So there's a need for this, and there's also interest in it. How might it work in practice? With about 6 months remaining in their overseas service, Peace Corps volunteers could decide whether or not they wanted to apply for a third year in the United States. If accepted, they'd remain under the Peace Corps umbrella, but be considered more like a Peace Corps fellow rather than a volunteer, as they'd be paid an entry-level government salary and have access to benefits. As needed, they would take modules that have already been designed by the Foreign Service Institute for State Department employees. And to the extent possible, they would be seconded to their home congressional district, given their familiarity with issues that are of interest and concern the people who live in their district. Like volunteers do overseas, they would first assess their district context and coordinate with the congressional district director to determine an outreach plan to best explain different global issues and foreign policies that affect their congressional district and state, taking advantage of opportunities to share those at cultural, religious, and educational events and institutions. I anticipate having about 600 return Peace Corps volunteers per year, or about 15% of the current cohort that's overseas at any given time, and it would cost around $36 million, which is on average about 11 cents per American, which is a pretty decent price for more globally informed citizenry. But I want to close on an anecdote on why I really think this $36 million is a sound investment. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Togo from 2003 to 2005. During my last few months of service, my dad came to visit me. He was 57 at the time, and it was his first time to travel outside the United States. He spent most of his life as a corn and soybean farmer 90 miles west of Chicago. Though he's always been globally minded, it was his first experience to interact with people of the Islamic faith because I lived in a predominantly Muslim village. It was certainly his first chance to witness present-day subsistence farming. But he didn't come away from the experience thinking that what Togo needed was additional food aid. What he saw was that Togo needed improved infrastructure, better transportation systems for their crops, better storage systems for their crops, mechanized farming to be able to farm at scale. And when he reads about extremism in present-day West Africa, he knows those are outliers. It's not reflective of the population that he met when he was visiting. And so the stories I share with him and the experiences that he's had really influences what he thinks US foreign policy should be in that part of the world. And while every American can't have that firsthand experience, what we can do is better invest in Peace Corps volunteers when they return to the United States to give them a structure to better educate Americans about what's going on in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Climate change feels like a really overwhelming global issue, but we're actually going to address it through millions of local projects all around the world. Small and medium-sized businesses are going to implement many of these, and they need to be part of the solution because all of their small individual impacts actually add up to an overall substantial impact. We could be talking about a small fleet of delivery trucks, or maybe a landlord who owns a single small building. So I propose that Chicago should form a nonprofit green bank to help small and medium-sized businesses increase their access to climate project financing. I'd like to begin by describing green banks through an analogy. When a business wants to upgrade their physical assets, they likely need to go out and get financing to pay for the project up front. Especially for small and medium-sized businesses, an investor or a lender is essentially being asked to carry a bag of money on a tightrope across a canyon, a real risk. So think of the Green Bank as the organization that takes their own time and money to turn the tightrope into a bridge. A green bank then is just a common name for a mission-driven climate investment fund that uses its own seed capital to reduce risks for private investors, basically getting them off the sidelines. Now, we know that finding that seed funding certainly would be a political challenge, but how much do we already spend on flood prevention and flood damage, for example? Budgets reflect values, and we need to keep this in mind. And certainly, we've been moving in the right direction for a few years already. A variety of federal, state, and local programs already do exist to help incentivize or finance climate projects. And as mentioned, it may be possible that a commercial bank might fund a project, but as we've noted, they may not fund sufficient amounts, they may not fund on favorable terms, or they may not fund at all. But money is available. It's available for the right projects, and institutional investors are looking to align their portfolios with the Paris climate goals. The Chicago Green Bank can act as a single branded entry point for climate investors, helping them to find local investment opportunities and encouraging them to bring their money here. So why am I bringing this up now? The Daley administration developed Chicago's first climate action plan all the way back in 2008. But now the Lightfoot administration is looking to take this further. We've been part of the network of C40 climate cities for a few years now, sharing best practices and plans, and the city's currently modeling various decarbonization pathway scenarios. We're developing a net zero carbon building plan, and the revised climate action plan is under discussion. The bottom line is that our ambitions are increasing, and as a greater number of businesses attempt projects, at least some will be denied the necessary funding, and funding availability needs to match our ambitions. And this is why we need a climate bank right now. The Coalition for Green Capital, which helps to start green banks around the US, has worked with all 20 US green banks, including those listed below, and has observed that these organizations always help to eliminate at least one of 4 common climate finance barriers. So think of these as the tightropes and the bridges. So if our landlord, for example, wants to install an early stage technology like a hydrogen fueled water heater, the green bank may actually connect the landlord with a commercial bank and a technical expert to help lower the project's risk. If this landlord wants to go further and reduce their carbon footprint by over 50%, they may actually end up considering this to be marginally economic. It might take 10 to 15 years to pay this project back through the energy savings, but the green bank can step in and act as a co-investor to help improve financing terms. These are both interesting climate project ideas, but if the investor also believes that the landlord might be a credit risk, the green bank can potentially set up a loan loss reserve fund, basically acting like a co-signer on a loan. And finally, maybe this landlord can't manage to get the funding to install a single electric vehicle charging station at their building, but the green bank may do the legwork to go find 500 different buildings that all want to install EV charging and bundle them together and bring them to an institutional investor to obtain funding for their projects. This is a model that already works. For the past 10 years, billions in green bank funding have led to billions more in private co-funding for projects that have reduced carbon footprint, improved air quality, and provided protection against harsher weather events. And we can do the same here. So the mayor's office should facilitate creation of a Chicago Green Bank to help small and medium-sized businesses increase their access to climate project financing. Thank you.
Thank you again for attending this evening's presentations. As you can tell from this group of emerging leaders, there are some big, bold ideas of how to make change in the city and the world around us. As a reminder, if you have questions for any of the panelists, you can put them into your browser at ccga.live. So we have a host of really incredible questions already pinging across the platform. And I'm very tempted to give one to each of you. Knowing we only have 10 minutes, I'm going to start with a question to each of you first. So if you could speak with one stakeholder to advance your proposal, who would it be? It's a little bit of a big one. Lauren, I'm going to start with you as our first presenter this evening.
It's a great question. I would speak to whoever is leading the deliberations and the current formation of the infrastructure plan to tell them they could get more bang for their buck if they include prison apprenticeships.
Wonderful, succinct, and right back to your proposal. I love it. Joy, let's go to you.
I think the government innovation team within Bloomberg Philanthropies, they're already doing work like this with data and integrating it into cities. So it's a perfect integration for them.
Kim.
Yeah, great question. I would say Dr. Miguel Cardona, the new Secretary of Education. There's opportunity here for innovation and to be able to propose to Congress opportunities for reform of the Pell Grant program.
Yumi.
I'm going to copy Kim and say the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra.
Nice, tight, right back. So hopefully DC's ears are ringing. Kendra.
I actually want to start with the Chicago Teachers Union, their leadership and their delegates, because one question you always get asked is, well, how would the union feel about this? How would the teachers feel about this? And as a former teacher, I actually feel like this offers a lot of great things for teachers, including higher compensation. And I'd like to start there because I think it could really be a partnership with teachers in the union.
Rachel.
The congressional representatives that are in charge of the Peace Corps reauthorization bill every year and get to decide how much money and where that money goes.
And John.
I think the person to speak with would be Mayor Lightfoot's new Chief Sustainability Officer, Angela Tovar, who's been in the position for about 6 to 9 months, I believe, and has a very strong focus on equity and would be a very good person to push this forward.
Great. So Lauren, this is a question for you. Given the difficulty in implementing jobs programs generally, how do you foresee overcoming the potential political pushback against a jobs program for incarcerated individuals?
It's a great question. I mean, honestly, I think you need both programs to work alongside one another. I think with prison apprenticeships, it really comes back to this opportunity to kill two birds with one stone and maximize, the spending that you're doing. I think also one of the things I didn't mention in my presentation is just this idea that with normal apprenticeships, you have to go out, you have to find the people that are interested in participating, you have to get them to enroll, and you have to get them to complete the program. With prison apprenticeships, not only are you also addressing the recidivism issue, you also have a, mind my pun, a captive audience of people who we know want these programs and are also statistically more likely to actually complete them. So overall, I think it's a sound investment to address two really important challenges at the same time.
Wonderful. Joy, a question to you. Who do you envision will craft the mapping? You mentioned Bloomberg Philanthropies. And is this something that would be done at a city level or a state level?
So I think it's done at a city level with 82% of the US population living in cities or a little under that. That's where a lot of these issues can be addressed. So I think it's something that happens at the city level. And again, a lot of the mapping is already happening within the philanthropy, which is why it's a more seamless integration because they're working with cities.
Wonderful. Kim, not to be too predictable in this order, but as you make this proposal on changing up the Pell Grant structure, do you think there needs to be a new bureaucracy put in place? And if so, what would that look like practically?
Yeah, great question. I don't believe a new bureaucracy would be able to put in place. I feel that, right now the financial aid system is fairly complex, right? So there's opportunity for the institutions to be able to help manage this effort and simplifying efforts for students. Right now with residential universities already built in the housing costs if a student is staying on campus, and they already have a system that will be able to incorporate additional Pell Grant funding into that effort. And for students who live off campus or other colleges that don't have housing, there's opportunity to have a system that aligns with what colleges have been currently doing for emergency aid applications, students testifying and indicating where their aid is needed to go, and the colleges can help facilitate this effort. The idea is to simplify the Pell Grant program, particularly for students from low-income households and first-generation college students, so that the financial aid system is not too complex.
Wonderful. Yumi, a question to you. So can you provide some ideas or examples of what are some of the metrics you think would be useful for these hyperlocal task forces so that they can ensure, success in measuring these programs?
Well, I think the first thing is the simplest one is patient satisfaction surveys. But I think beyond that, we can look beyond just the metrics medically, even though that is important. Looking at the rates of, for example, deaths related to the maternal mortality rate, which is an example of huge racial health disparities. You can look at what that looks like in the actual hospital, within the confines of the hospital. But one other thing you could think about is, are the emergency rooms held to the same standards as the waiting areas where people who have access to higher quality insurance, are they held, are they, maintained at the same standards? Are you looking at parking and making sure that parking is affordable for everyone who is able to come into the hospital? So I think the metrics should include the racial health disparities within the hospital, but I think we should think holistically about all of the barriers that are posed to people who are trying to get access to healthcare.
Great. Kendra, a question for you that touches on a comment you made. How do you get both teachers and unions, but also parents to buy into this proposal?
Right. So I was, as I mentioned, I was a teacher for 5 years and I worked every summer. And I worked every summer because I had to, because I needed money. And most of my friends who were teachers also worked during the summer for at least part of the summer. And many who didn't, it was because they were at home taking care of their school-age children who would be in school if we had an extended school year. So I think we shouldn't start with the assumption that teachers or teachers unions would be opposed to having a slightly longer work year for higher commensurate compensation. I think most teachers are already there, but they're piecing it together themselves, and they might appreciate the continuity of it. As a parent, I think we need to remember that we're talking about young children here. So I have 3 children and 2 of them in CPS. And I spend a lot of time looking for places to put them in the summer. And so I actually think we shouldn't assume that parents would balk at a longer school year. I think many parents would actually view it as windfall. So, and one more thing is this is the right time for it, because COVID-19 has made us realize we're going to need serious interventions to make up for the learning losses that kids have suffered. The head of the American Federation of Teachers has said we might need summer school. When I was a teacher, we used to have a saying that if you could get something in the school for 4 years, it became a tradition that you could never take away. So I think if we implement this as a method to overcome some of the challenges from the pandemic and the learning loss, when we see how great the benefits are, people will want to keep it.
All right, great. We've got 2 minutes and 2 questions. Rachel, so really curious, given the rise of nationalism, do you think that the current political environment prevents a program like that, what you're proposing, from happening?
Gosh, I'd argue that it makes it even more critical. I think that 2 quick points. Peace Corps has always enjoyed bipartisan support, and I would anticipate this not changing that. I think people sharing their real life stories in person, talking and dialoguing with other people is much more effective than sharing a Twitter headline and perhaps a perpetuating a stereotype of things. So I think it's actually makes it even more necessary, and that it could have a lot of support from all parties.
Great. And not last but not least, John, we've got a question here about, if you're somebody who is an investor who already has access to investment opportunities, why would you care and support a Chicago Green Bank?
Sure thing. Great question. So you already have access to investment opportunities. Certainly there will be more here. And just to make the point that green banks actually do create substantial returns for their investors, they reinvest their own funds to become a nonprofit and essentially stay steady, but they manage to return profits to their investors. And so it's another opportunity. It's a way to participate in climate project financing, as we said, and investors around the world are aligning to do that. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, there are dozens of questions here. I will collate them and share them to you all. But first off, I want to thank you all for all the time and energy you put into your work over the course of this year. And I want to thank everybody on the Chicago Council and within the council community for tuning in this evening. We appreciate your support. And if you'd like to revisit any of these proposals and perhaps share them on, they'll be posted to the council's social channels and website shortly. Thank you again and have a good evening.